The White House is defunding USAID, one of the largest distributors of foreign aid, and blaming it on wasteful spending, like a D.E.I. musical in Ireland. But as Phil, Skye, and I unpack, the real losers are Christian relief organizations like World Relief and Catholic Charities, which now face devastating budget cuts. Then, it's been over 20 years since the release of Blue Like Jazz, the best-selling book that made faith feel cool. Did it offer a helpful critique of evangelicalism, or was this the beginning of the rise of vibes-based Christianity? Also, New York Times columnist Ross Douthat joins Skye to discuss his new book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. He explains why our increasingly secular culture is still drawn to spirituality, and why rejecting religious institutions in favor of DIY faith might not be the answer. Plus, we have a trailer for a new season of Why I'm Still a Christian. That's right, Why I'm Still a Christian Season 2 is out now, but only on HOLYPOST Plus. This season features Beth Moore, Adam Kinzinger, and Rachel Denhollander. Also this week, we have a new episode of our Hill to Die On series, where I take the stand that watching The Bachelor is sinful. If you want to access these episodes along with the Skye Pod, Getting Schooled, and bonus interviews, you can sign up for a 1-week free trial of HOLYPOST Plus at holypost.com/plus. All right, here is episode 656.
Hey there, welcome to the HOLYPOST podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I'm here with other people, 2 other people, not 1, not 3, not 17, 2. I'm here with Skye Jitani in studio. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
We have to record early because Skye's going on vacation next week, which is not nice.
What do you mean not nice?
It's not nice.
I have earned this vacation.
We'll vote. We'll vote on that.
Okay.
And Kaitlyn Chess. Hi.
Hi, Phil.
She's remote. Not as in emotionally distant, as in not in the studio. If you know.
I will be next week.
You'll be emotionally distant?
I'll be emotionally distant, but in the studio next week.
I look forward to that. And now it's time for the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the HOLYPOST. Skye and Phil and the HOLYPOST. And sometimes Kaitlyn.
This episode of the HOLYPOST is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/HOLYPOST. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/HOLYPOST and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. This episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. Hey, if you're like me, you want to use your money to do good in the world, to support causes you really believe in. But by the end of the month, your money's all gone. Maybe it's because, like me, you've got like 50 subscriptions, half of which you don't even remember signing up for. That app for your kids that they used like once, that delivery service, the fitness plan that didn't work out so well. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills and free up money for the things you really care about. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has helped save its members an average of $740 a year with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. I can see all my subscriptions in one place, and Rocket Money will help me cancel the ones I'm not using with just a few taps. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/HOLYPOST. That's rocketmoney.com/HOLYPOST. rocketmoney.com/HOLYPOST. And thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this episode. We're still in our new studio. If you haven't noticed, there's a light that isn't working quite right. I'm trying to get the company in China to send me a new one, but I guess it'll cost 10% more because of tariffs now to get the new one. I still don't know what to put on the wall behind me, but we'll figure that out.
We're working on that.
Well, we have top people working on it, except Skye's going on vacation, so that just shuts down the whole. Everything shuts down when Skye leaves the building.
I am confident that is not the case.
You are our everything. You are our morning and our night.
Oh, I thought you were going to break out in a song.
You are the wind beneath our wings.
That's the one I'm waiting for. I want to hear your best Bette Midler. I was going to say Met Bidler.
Bette Midler. Bette Midler. I didn't want to talk about him. I don't like to talk about him, but stuff keeps happening.
Phil, it's going to be a long 4 years.
Someone just said that to me on Twitter this morning.
It wasn't me.
No, it wasn't you, but they said that exact thing, Phil. It's going to be a long 4 years.
Pace yourself.
Yeah, no, but here's the deal, guys. Here's the deal. Right now, they're doing everything. They're doing the shock and awe thing. They're doing all the stuff that they prepped ahead of time with the Project 2025 guys that they claimed they didn't know at the time.
They're like the everything bagel of presidential administrations.
Yeah, and it is. They're following a playbook that says the more you do all at once, the less they can keep up with it and oppose it.
Right.
So at least some of the stuff that probably isn't legal is going to get through. And then that's a victory. So as Steve Bannon would say, they're flooding the zone right now.
Excrement.
Yeah, that was the rest of his quote, but I wasn't going to give it because it's not the news of the but. We have a new White House faith office. Trump taps Pastor Paula White for White House faith office. I think everyone would agree this is great news, that if there's one person you want in the White House representing all people of faith, it would be someone who can call angels from Africa. Trump announced a series of sweeping faith-based initiatives, including a new presidential commission on religious liberty and an executive order targeting perceived anti-Christian bias. Trump also said he would reestablish a White House faith office led by Paula White, a controversial celebrity televangelist. One thing that the people in his orbit have in common is they're typically people that are on TV.
Yeah, he likes
people that are on TV.
And who look good on TV.
Right. Here's a quote from our former and current president. It was faith that led the pilgrims to cross an ocean and settle this majestic continent. And
he did not write this. I'm telling you that right now.
I think he added on this line after it. It was faith that led the pilgrims to cross an ocean and settle this majestic continent. And we're going to keep it majestic. So that isn't really something a writer would write.
Is it all caps?
Because then you have to have some metric of majesty. Are we like an 8 on the majesty scale? And have we fallen at all? Are we any less majestic than we were at our founding? Here in America, we are, once again, a nation that believes, ready for it? In ourselves. We believe in our destiny and trust in the providence of Almighty God. These were remarks at the National Prayer Breakfast.
Oh, yeah, that was yesterday.
Was it yesterday?
Yeah. It's the first Thursday of February.
Trump said the new task force would, quote, immediately halt all forms of anti-Christian targeting and discrimination within the federal government.
Does that include Christian immigrants and refugees?
No. No. And fully prosecute anti-Christian violence and vandalism in our society. And to move heaven and earth, we're going to move heaven and earth as an administration, to defend the rights of Christians and religious believers nationwide.
Off the top of your head, either of you, do you know of any news story that you would label as Christian persecution, vandalism, or violence?
No. In America?
In America.
No.
What about the Biden administration threatening to withhold government funding from Christian institutions that wouldn't adopt their LGBT policies? Is that persecution?
I mean, that's a policy. I don't know the details of that. That's a policy question that should be looked at and figured out, whatever. But that's not violence.
Okay.
Vandalism.
I don't think the definition of persecution is violence.
But what was the statement? It said we're going to end Christian...
We will prosecute anti-Christian violence and vandalism.
That's it. Violence and
vandalism.
vandalism.
Other violence and vandalism that we've decided we're not going to prosecute? Like, you burned that church. That wasn't about that it's a church. That was just you didn't like that neighborhood and you wanted to clear some ground. That's okay. That's okay.
I get that there's different policies of different administrations, things like that's always going to be there.
Yeah.
And yeah, we should look at that. But violence and vandalism, that's what my question is. Where is the violence and vandalism targeting Christians? Because they're Christians.
I think the news media suppresses it because of their anti-Christian bias.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. A lot of very conservative Christians, like that you might see on Twitter, not that I would, but you might, are happy about all the Christian talk, but quite upset that it's Paula White. Because number one, she's a woman pastor, so that's a huge no-no. Number two, she's a Pentecostal, charismatic, prosperity gospel. So she's a heretic on several dimensions, both being female and being prosperity gospel.
You can't spell heretic without her.
Skye.
Where did you get that?
It just came to me.
No way.
Yes, it did.
Send Skye a hat with his new
No one
his
do
new
that.
catchphrase.
No.
That's Skye's new catchphrase. You heard it here first, folks. Can't spell.
Hopefully everyone listening knows my view about
Heretic.
women in ministry, which is quite egalitarian. But yeah, facetious. I'm just joking.
Yeah. So anyway, that's an update. And, that's part of the thing where people will say, oh, the administration is more Christian than the prior administration. See, that's a good thing. We will point out some other things that might lead one to believe this administration is less Christian than other administrations. We're shutting down U.S. foreign aid, international aid and development department. Quite controversial. It is cutting funding. World Relief had to send out another emergency request because now that USAID is being shut down by Elon Musk, who apparently is our new king, they're losing a bunch of funding for work they're currently doing in other countries. Also, there's the National Catholic Reporter. Have you heard of this? The National Catholic Reporter is an independent Catholic news agency. Their editorial board put out a piece yesterday, as a matter of fact. The piece is entitled "Silence in the Face of Trump's Cruelty is Complicity." For those of us in the Catholic community, cruelty should be especially alarming and a call to action. The unprecedented cruelty of the Trump administration was on full display with the news that Catholic Relief Services, and by the way, Catholic Relief Services, I believe, is the largest relief agency in the world with a budget of about $1.5 billion that goes towards education and healthcare and community development all over the world. I mean, it's like 10 times bigger than World Relief. The news that Catholic Relief Services faces massive cuts in staff and programs because of reductions in international aid. Layoffs have already begun as Catholic Relief Services has been forced to begin shutting down programs funded by USAID, which supplies about half of the Catholic organization's $1.5 billion budget. The National Catholic Reporter editorial board continues, "The U.S. was never a nation of angels, but we have aspired to noble ideals no matter how imperfectly lived over our history. We are now in danger of abandoning any pretext to living those ideals. Cruelty this truly is, with no other apparent motive than to demean others and to save what amounts to a paltry sum in federal spending. For those of us in the Catholic community, cruelty should be especially alarming and a call to action." It shouldn't really be controversial that if you're Catholic, you should find cruelty alarming, historically.
I don't think you have to be Catholic.
No, but if you are Catholic,
Right.
this should be kind of a no-brainer. I mean, they shouldn't be saying something controversial. Hey,
You're right,
as
yeah.
Catholics, we should be alarmed by cruelty.
Is the argument, if to play devil's advocate, that this isn't actual cruelty because this is what I'm hearing spun out there is USAID is full of corruption and this money's not going where it should be going and it's lining the pockets of organizations and warlords overseas or whatever, and it's just rife with with corruption.
Yes.
So this isn't cruelty. This is just good governance.
Elon Musk said, this isn't just a bad apple. It isn't an apple at all. It's a ball of worms. So the whole aid agency is just worms, rotten through and through. To support this idea, last week, the White House issued a statement to explain how bad USAID is and why it can't be saved. It just has to be gutted. The Trump administration this week dismantled the U.S. Agency for International Development, the primary vehicle for U.S. foreign aid. The White House issued a statement justifying its actions, titled, this is the title of the White House statement, "At USAID, waste and abuse runs deep." The statement claimed that USAID has been unaccountable to taxpayers as it funnels massive sums of money to the ridiculous and in many cases malicious pet projects of entrenched bureaucrats with next to no oversight. The news release then listed 12 examples of this gross negligence, corruption, plucked from the websites of right-wing media.
Which I'm sure are very well researched.
Washington Post looked into all 12 claims and discovered that one of them was an accurate claim.
There you go.
Out of the 12. And they cited donations and grants as small as $32,000. That was an example. So here's some examples. Okay, in fiscal year, this all ties together and you're going to understand it. Kaitlyn, stay with me. Are you with me, Kaitlyn?
Oh, I'm with you. I'm with you.
Okay. In fiscal year 2023, USAID was appropriated about $25 billion by Congress. The White House identified only about $12 million in grants, problematic grants, out of $25 billion. One of those grants was for $6 million, which means 11 of the 12 evil grants they used to prove the evil of USAID totaled $6 million out of $25 billion.
Which isn't a terrible batting average. Like, you know that any large government program is going to have some problems in it, right?
No other government program wrestles with fraud or abuse or misuse of funds. This is it. We've found the only one. So here's I am trying to help. I'm looking right at the camera. I'm appealing to you, dear listener, dear viewer. We actually have something to do here. The National Catholic Reporters editorial board ended with a call for Catholics to reach out to their bishops, reach out to their congressmen, and a link for how to do that. And we'll post that connection if you want to voice your concerns to Catholic bishops. According to surveys, many Americans have a misguided view of how much money the United States devotes to foreign aid. Polls consistently reveal that Americans believe it is about 25% of the federal budget. That's me gulping in disbelief. And that a majority believe it should be cut down to more like 10%.
Okay. Let's do 10%.
In reality, foreign aid is less than 1% of the budget. On top of that, other countries are more generous with foreign aid. By raw dollars, the United States gives more foreign aid than any other country, but when measured as a percentage of a country's economy, the United States is far behind nations such as Britain, Norway, Sweden, Germany, and the Netherlands. It's interesting that all of those countries that have a strong commitment to foreign aid have a very strong Protestant Christian history.
History is the key word there.
Yes. The United Nations has set a target of contributing 0.7% of gross national income in development aid. United States clocks in with less than 0.2% of gross national income. It's near the bottom of the list of major democracies. Much of the time, this aid does not actually leave U.S. shores. About 2/3 of U.S. foreign assistance funds in fiscal year 2018 were obligated to U.S.-based entities. For instance, food aid for other countries must be purchased in the United States. You don't send money overseas, you buy the food in the United States. It helps U.S. farmers, and by law must be shipped on U.S. carriers. You can't even give the money to a Chinese ship. You got to use U.S. ships to carry it over, with the exception of some aid given to, guess where? Israel.
Yeah.
All military aid must be used to purchase U.S. military equipment and training, meaning foreign military aid in reality is a jobs program in the United States.
Okay.
I want to go through a couple of the specifics
All right.
that they listed, because this is telling.
I have questions.
This is an example of something that you tend to see a lot on the far right, which is we make an accusation and then we look for data to support the accusation. And the data is often weak, to be generous. Okay, complaint. USAID gave $70,000 for the production of a, quote, DEI musical in Ireland.
How much money?
I do want to see that.
$70,000 for a DEI musical in Ireland. That's the claim.
Bill, I think this is just asking for you to parody.
I want to write an Irish DEI musical. Oh, there aren't enough leprechauns in this place of work. I'm going to sing about it. This is wrong. It wasn't USAID. It was a State Department grant given by the U.S. ambassador to Ireland, who hosted a musical event featuring a Grammy-winning folk duo along with other Irish and American musicians.
So it had nothing to do with USAID.
Had nothing to do with USAID.
Okay.
Here's another one. $47,000. And this is our new press secretary speaking in front of the White House, reading these aloud. $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. That's shocking. I cannot. We need to shut that agency down.
That sounds like a Mad Lib.
Because I think I think one transgender opera is one too many, sir. One too many. Half a transgender opera?
But 47, okay, I don't want to,
Maybe.
but $47,000 is like coffee creamer in the federal government budget.
This claim is also wrong. USAID did not fund this. The White House appears to be referring to a $25,000 State Department grant to a university in Bogota to stage an opera called As One, composed by an American composer. The rest of the money came from other sources. This is a well-known opera in the U.S., highly acclaimed by audiences. Anyway, it came from the State Department, not USAID. $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. More fun Mad Libs.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's what the whole thing is.
This is wrong. USAID did not fund this, and it was not specifically transgender. It was a grant from the State Department under the guise of public diplomacy to cover expenses to produce a tailor-made comic featuring an LGBTQ hero to address social and mental health issues in Peru. Okay, now some of these you could say, I don't want to see any taxpayer dollars going to promote anything LGBT. And that's valid. That's valid. And they could certainly say, let's tell the State Department not to fund anything involving LGBTQ people. And you could say, agree, disagree. That's fine. But this isn't USAID. This has nothing to do with what we're currently shutting down. And it's the case of if the State Department wanted to do that and you don't want the State Department to do that, tell the State Department not to do that. Don't close a different agency.
Which is Marco Rubio's agency now.
It is. $6 million. This is the big one. $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt. What? Why do we care about tourism in Egypt? That's shocking. This is wrong. This initiative was launched in the first Trump administration to increase educational opportunities and strengthen the livelihoods of the people of North Sinai. The money provides access to transportation for rural communities and economic livelihood programming for families. There is no mention of tourism. Anyway, I could actually go on.
I'm sure you could.
Because 11 of the 12 are grossly inaccurate. But this is the case we're building to say, all right, Catholic Charities, you need to lay off half of your workers around the world now.
Okay, can I ask my questions now?
Do you have questions?
I do.
Okay.
Maybe Kaitlyn has.
I'm a little riled up.
I know you are,
Skye.
but of all the things in the government that Trump and Musk could be going after for symbolic reasons, for fiscal reasons,
Skye.
this is my first question, is why USAID, right? When there's many, many, many other things they could go after that are a higher percentage of the budget or that maybe have more legitimate waste and abuse. But then number two, how can the president shut down this agency when it was statutorily endorsed and created by Congress in, I think, 1998? Congress created and established
that's a
USAID. So the president can't unilaterally just end something that Congress legislated.
Do you know, Skye, what the principle of the unitary president is?
Yeah, I do. But the unitary executive is not the unitary government.
These agencies are in the executive branch.
But they were created by Congress.
And the current administration is pushing a very extreme view. The unitary executive principle says the president is the head of the executive branch, and therefore everything that's in the executive branch, which means he should be able to make any decisions, including about how to spend money. Even if the money has been approved by Congress, the president can refuse to spend it. That's the theory that's being pressed.
Right, but
so he's not shutting down an agency, he's defunding an agency.
Again, if Congress has said, we create this agency and we are funding this agency to do these things, the president executes the laws passed by Congress.
And that's where we're headed toward the Supreme Court.
I know. This is the constitutional crisis that we are moving quickly toward.
But Skye, a transgender comic book in Peru, this cannot stand.
Okay.
Kaitlyn,
help us.
Kaitlyn?
Two things this makes me think of. One is this is such a good example of what happens when you think your political engagement as a citizen is just consuming political media or having opinions on national issues. Because I think a lot of the people who are hearing about this and support this is a fully abstract question.
Right.
Not only are they gaining, to Phil's very detailed explanation, they're gaining false information and making an opinion based off of false information, but they're also, they're trying to articulate a real concern underneath this all that Skye's been pointing out, is like that there is waste, there is fraud, they're concerned about that. I assume a lot of the folks in support of this are also kind of America first people who are thinking we don't need to spend money on other countries, we need to be focusing internally. I disagree with that philosophy, but at the root, there is some good desire there to take care of people in this country, to end waste and fraud. That abstract concern, yes, Phil?
Hold your thought. I'm going to come right back to continue that. But what you just said is actually on my list of things to mention, because I've heard from very many people who complain about me wanting to help refugees that we need to help the people that live here before we help the people that live there. And I just have to point out, there's a huge overlap of the Venn diagram of the people who say we need to help the people here first, who, when you propose legislation to help the people here, vote against it. We do not want to help people. So it is not just we want to help the people here. It is really people should help themselves, and I don't want anything to do with it.
It's just easier to cut off the help to the people who can't vote.
Well, you need a reason.
It appears principled.
It appears principled.
Right.
We should help the people here. Okay, well then how about if we do an experiment with guaranteed basic income? Heck no, I'm voting no. How about if we try to get people more access to health care so that more women feel comfortable carrying their pregnancies to term and we have better maternal health outcomes? Heck no, they're poor people. They need to take care of themselves.
Or let's take the 1% of funding going to USAID and let's put that into, I don't know, community development or education in poor communities here in the U.S. They're not going to vote for that.
Yeah.
So
Back to you, Kaitlyn.
The other part of this is that those abstract concerns, when it's fully like I'm consuming media from my home and I'm having opinions about big national issues I don't have a lot of agency over, it can seem really principled, fully in the abstract. What you've just described, Phil, is all of the actual mechanics of how this ends up affecting particular people, which is why we've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks talking about World Relief and how this affects organizations like World Relief in particular. It affects lots of other organizations too, including the ones you've mentioned. But that's where I wish we would direct attention, is don't just fight this on the level of big abstract concern. Think about how does this trickle down to affecting particular relief agencies, which often are Christian and have Christian reasons for what they're doing. And you probably are not, when you are tweeting something about this at a big abstract national level, thinking about the world relief workers in your city who are helping set up apartments for refugee families that have a legitimate status, that you're not thinking of that kind of lack of funding. You're thinking about this big abstract question. The other thing I think this reminds me of that I think is really important to say is, and the piece that you referenced, Phil, about calling this cruelty, sometimes I think in the last few years we have been we've been desensitized to the cruelty in our politics, but also we've slowly bought into the lie that it is somehow uniquely partisan for us to call out cruelty when it shows up on one side of the aisle or the other, as if it's inherently partisan to say the president, the leader of this party, is doing something cruel outside of some of these policy things, has said about human beings cruel things. We've gotten so used to that, and we've gotten so used to this deep divide, especially in Christian churches, of Trump supporting people and Trump opposing people, that I think it bears reiterating that like calling out cruel things that Trump says and does is not partisan. Like you would do, if you would do the same of a leader of another party, it is not partisan. It is not partisan to say, it would be partisan to say Republicans are never right about anything and I hate them. It is not partisan to say this particular person has said and done cruel things. And it is actually a Christian obligation to call those out, especially when that person is claiming Christian faith in support of the things they're doing. And as much as we want to be wise in how we talk about this, and we're not trying to just, without any reason offend people on the other end of the political aisle, I think it's important to just state that like, you are not a Democrat for saying that Trump is doing bad things. You are not being partisan for saying that Trump is saying and doing cruel things. That's just calling out cruelty for what it is.
Anyway, why am I bringing this up? Why am I bringing any of this up? Because I'm a little worked up. The world's largest Christian relief agency just lost half of its budget to do half of the work it does around the world. Why? Because someone on the White House lawn is complaining about transgender comic books in Peru. This is insane. It's absolutely insane. And so the reason we're talking about this is because you probably, if you're like me, you have friends and most likely relatives that you bump into online and sometimes in the real world who completely believe that USAID is a corrupt leftist organization and must be dismantled, and don't realize, first of all, how weak the arguments for doing that are, and second of all, how that's actually going to impact Christian organizations that do amazing work around the world. You need to know that. So you can hopefully, we'll put the Washington Post fact check just about the White House's statement. We'll post that on the show notes, and the statement from the National Catholic Reporter, we'll post that on the show notes, because the more we know, the more we can gently say to the people in our lives that we love, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. Actually, no, it wasn't $50 million worth of condoms for Gaza. It was $50 million in medical help for Gaza, which included family planning support, but also included field hospitals for a country whose hospitals were destroyed by American bombs. So it seems like it's okay if American dollars put in some field hospitals to help those people.
Could you imagine what the outcry would be if the Obama administration or the Biden administration had cut all of this funding to Catholic Charities or World Relief or Christian
on religious grounds?
Yeah,
you won't.
They would have been screaming to the rooftops that this is anti-Christian and this is.
And you can also rest assured that Catholic Relief Agency is not staging transgender musicals. That's not what they do. Okay.
Thanks, Phil.
Skye.
All right,
I'm a little worked up.
I can
Said
tell.
your piece.
Kaitlyn, you got anything else to say about anything? Kaitlyn?
The only thing I would add is I think, as you just described, Phil, it is very helpful to be able to refute false claims that people are making about USAID. If you are in conversation with family members about this, I think you should pair giving them factual information with curiosity about why this matters to them, and like deeper conversation about what values are animating why you care about this. Because I think a lot of the people who are believing the false information are not going to be persuaded by hearing new correct information. They might be more likely over time to be persuaded if you seem actually interested in why they care about the things they care about. And there might actually be a way down the rabbit hole of asking why they care about this so much that you find a way to connect it back to, actually, I also deeply care about Christian values in our government, which is why I want World Relief to be able to have access to this money, or for Catholic Charities to have access to this money. That could be a great point of connection, rather than just kind of like giving them the correct information, which is very helpful, but might not get at what the underlying issue is.
And if someone is making the argument, we have to shut it down because it's wasteful, Just point them to the military. The military wastes so much money on so many things. There was that whole, 30 years ago scandal of $1,000 hammers and $1,200 toilet seats. Never once did someone say, there's so much waste in this, we need to shut the whole thing down.
Right.
Let's defund the military, take 90 days, figure out what we want to start back up again.
If this administration were actually led by serious people, the response would have been, I'm concerned about waste and abuse in USAID, and we're going to take a year and do a full audit of all the programs in USAID, and they're going to have to show that they're actually using those funds as directed for the purposes that we intended, and the programs that are not, we will shut down. That's what a serious, mature administration would do. And that's not what we're seeing.
But that doesn't generate shock and
Exactly.
awe. And we must generate shock and awe. Hey, it's the what anniversary of the best-selling book that made church cool? Summer? Oh, it's the 20s. I guess it's the 22nd anniversary, so it's not like a big 50th. Donald Miller's book, Blue Like Jazz, came out in 2003. Non-religious thoughts on Christian spirituality. It became a sensation. I remember it well.
I do too.
Sitting on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks and selling 1 million copies by 2008. The spiritual memoir captured the emerging momentum of the Christian hipster set, one critic wrote in Christianity Today in 2009. Blue Like Jazz attempted to correct a Christianity conflated with conservatism, but it has not offered a satisfying alternative. Both solutions of legalism or license ultimately are remnants of evangelical individualism. So at that point, there was a whole lot of legalism that people who grew up in evangelicalism were rebelling against, saying, I don't want to be told everything I can and cannot do. I want a little more freedom in my Christianity. And they're arguing that what Blue Like Jazz offered was a little unrooted or untethered freedom.
Kaitlyn, have you read Blue Like Jazz? Oh, look, she's holding a copy.
She's holding the book.
Wow.
I did as a teenager, yeah.
The tone and style of Miller's prose resonates with what philosopher James K.A. Smith then wrote of the emergent church. Rather than a movement, it's better understood as a growing sensibility within the contemporary church. Blue Like Jazz offered a compelling story for American evangelicals to have Jesus without his bride. But the book's style and message increasingly center the individual. By 2014, Miller shared with his followers on social media that the church is not a huge part of my life. Part of it, not attending church, was I disagree with what was taught. I can't get with the certainty. So even the guy who wrote the book is checked out of church. If Blue Like Jazz gave its readers permission to leave their parents' Christianity, these same readers, like Miller himself, are now more likely to leave church altogether. And where they're getting... Miller said, I think Christian spirituality is like jazz music, a music birthed out of freedom. The phrase music birthed out of freedom requires us to ask. This is the writer in Christianity Today saying.
Ashley Hales.
Ashley Hales.
Ashley.
Do we know Ashley? I don't know Ashley.
Ashley's great.
You know Ashley? You know Ashley? That's fantastic. The phrase music birthed out of freedom requires us to ask, what is the end or goal of such freedom? For the generation coming out of the evils of chattel slavery in the U.S., freedom was thoroughly social, economic, political, and spiritual. The freedom Miller explores in Blue Like Jazz is of an infinitely lesser variety, less potent, more platform-oriented and individualized, and ultimately untethered from place, accountability, and the unchanging Word of God. But when our institutions are weak and frayed, as many say they are now, the mature response is to root out bureaucratic rot while also strengthening our common bonds. We defend and build simultaneously. We cannot tear down the church without also building it up. We cannot sever spiritual growth from the manner and place in which Jesus says it takes place. The church. So this is a call for, hey, don't give up on the bride of Christ, even if there's a social movement or a hit book that makes it seem like it's the cool thing to do.
Yeah, there's a strange link to the previous story about USAID and the Trump administration, and that is we seem to be living in an era of the American story in which everyone is eager to tear things down, and fewer people are actually committed to building things up. And it isn't that there aren't things worth tearing down or that need to be deconstructed, to use a cliche these days, but there has to be a part two. There has to be something that gets replaced or put in its place?
So we got rid of USAID and we added a group to root out anti-Christian violence in America.
Okay, great. But to Blue Like Jazz's point, it was critical of the institutional church, highlighting an individual relationship with Christ that was more improvisational, like
Yes,
jazz,
right.
but not rooted in anything more substantive that could be sustained. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think what I loved about this piece and what I thought, again, rereading that, I loved this book when I was a teenager. Like, I thought it was very inspiring and very cool. What I'm realizing that, as you pointed out, Skye, is sort of a parallel to our previous conversation, is that there is a version on the right and the left, and I mean that theologically and politically. There's like different portions of American evangelicalism to evangelicalism that are both non-institutional and very personal, and basically about vibes. Like, they're not consistent. There's not, even on the right and the left, like there's not a consistent philosophy here. There's just kind of a vibe. And I went back to, Ashley mentions this line from the book where he talks about he wants to say Christian spirituality as opposed to Christianity. And Christian spirituality is a non-political, mysterious system that can be experienced but not explained. And it just reminded me of, like, yeah, on both ends of the spectrum, there is this sense of Christianity is what, and you'll enjoy this, Skye, Christianity is what works for me, gets me what I want. And I can dispense of any of the political teaching, any of the communal teaching. Like, I don't need people to tell me what to do. I need something that gets me what I want. And literally the end of this paragraph says, I couldn't in good conscience tell a friend about a faith that didn't excite me. I couldn't share something I wasn't experiencing. And I wasn't experiencing Christianity. It didn't do anything for me at all. Like, it's essentially about vibes. The whole chapter on church is like, you know what churches are cool? Churches that use Latin, because Latin is cool. I mean, there's like a pretty consistent theme of just like, what is cool or edgy or interesting? That's what I'm looking for in a church. So it's about vibes, and it's also about what gets me what I want.
That's Christian consumerism.
Yeah, you can see that so easily on the political right. And then I think sometimes for those of us who have experienced Christianity on the political right so intimately, it's hard to see how it can crop up in other places. And returning back to this book today, just like skimming through it a little bit, I was so reminded of people I experience now today who have left American conservative evangelicalism, but are still looking for a faith that basically gets them what they want and doesn't ask very much of them. Mm-hmm. And you can find a Christianity that will rubber stamp or baptize your political positions, whether they're on the right or the left. And you can find a form of Christianity that will say, this will help you feel better, be more centered, have a happier life. I mean, that's literally Trump's prayer breakfast speech said, religion is good for people. It makes them happy. Like, we're looking for something that gets me what I want and doesn't ask very much of me. And it turns out you can't avoid that just by getting out of a particular partisan box or a particular tradition or denomination or form of Christianity.
Totally. I had a conversation just yesterday, which will be out in an upcoming episode of the Skye Pod, with James Bryan Smith. We were talking about Dallas Willard and kind of his legacy. And Jim brought up what's going on with John Mark Comer and all of the focus on practicing the disciplines and the spirit. And it's great. I love John Mark and the stuff he's doing. But we were talking about why are so many young adults especially attracted to this stuff? And my fear, I don't have anything to base this on, but my fear is that some people are drawn to that because it's helpful. And I use the example of, like, I am hearing from people, like, I really need to practice the Sabbath in my life because I'm so busy and I'm so distracted, and the Sabbath is so helpful. Great. I agree. Wonderful. But you know who practiced the Sabbath better than anyone? The people who murdered Jesus. Mm-hmm. So these disciplines, these practices, some people are engaging them because they're super helpful in a convoluted, distracted, technologically crazy society like ours, and they're drawn to this. But what they forget at the center of it, they forget about Jesus. Yeah. That it's ultimately got to be about him and not just what is useful to me.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, there's this great review of John Mark Comer's work by the theologian Brad East in a CT article from probably a year ago. And he has this amazing line that gets at what Ashley is saying in this article as well. He has this amazing line where he basically says, this is a spirituality for spiritual Navy SEALs. Like, yes, practice is really great. Yes, spiritual disciplines are really great. But if your account of those things is entirely personal, it requires a superhuman person to make this work. It is like the person who goes to the gym every day and is just trying to, like, engineer a perfect body or a perfect life, or in this case, it's a perfect spiritual life. And Brad East's point is, if there's not an account of the church, If you can't just slide into a pew one day and be like, I don't actually have the will within me to practice all the spiritual disciplines today. I don't know if I believe the words of the Nicene Creed. I'm just here, and someone else's faith will buffet me. And I'm relying on the regular, yes, practice of the sacraments, but it is not about just me having orchestrated the perfect rhythm of a spiritual life to get it right. It's me relying on this larger community that I belong to. The same is true of Ashley's work on Blue Like Jazz. It's like some of the stuff in here is a really beautiful description of a faith that is critical of some of the conservative Republican forms of Christianity that Donald Miller was rightly critical of. But if it doesn't have that institutional shape to it, the vibes will run out.
Right.
that it will be fumes at the end. You won't have anything else to lay a foundation in.
Here's the last thing I'll say about this, and then we need to wrap up. I thought Blue Like Jazz, when it came out, looked really cool. It was a great cover. It was a great title. The marketing was great. The vibe was great. I thought, this Donald Miller must be a really cool Christian to have this really cool vibe. Within 5 years, he had ceased to be a Christian author and had become a marketing consultant. Selling his services online with podcasts and stuff, and he was a brand consultant. So he made a great brand about a view of Christianity, and then spent the rest of his life pursuing branding, not Christianity. That bothered me to see it happen in real time. There needs to be some meat on what we're pursuing. There's got to be meat in what we're pursuing, because otherwise I made a successful church and now I'm going to market the equipment we bought and the way we designed a service.
Yeah, we're going to take the church brand and franchise it, basically.
Yes, exactly. Okay, what's going on? Hey, everybody, exciting news. We got a brand new season of Why I'm Still a Christian coming up. In fact, it's ready. And because we love you so much, we're going to let you hear a little sneak peek right now. So here it is.
Why are you still a Christian, Beth Moore?
I have watched myself be called just unsaved over and over and over.
I've gotten a lot of death threats. Half of my family disowned me. They said I was part of the devil's army.
Then you end up with Dr. Larry Nasser.
I'm clinging to my faith by my fingernails. If I go and I talk to a pastor, I will probably walk out more harmed than helped.
I wanted to run for my life. I could feel the panic coming up in my throat.
If anybody tells you that standing up alone and doing the right thing is easy and doesn't cost and doesn't hurt and doesn't create doubt, they are lying to you.
The church had a pattern of covering up sexual abuse.
My doubts come up when I'm going, why didn't you stop this?
Does God really care? Is this something that matters to him? I was left to really wrestle through a lot of those questions, ultimately by myself.
Everything else might crumble, but he holds.
When he says my yoke is easy, my burden is light, he means it. He means it.
What I do know is this, that truth and goodness and beauty do exist.
You can't kick me out of Jesus. You can kick me out of denomination. You can kick me out of church. You can kick me out of your circle. You can kick me out of ministry, but you cannot kick me out of Christ.
Pretty cool, huh? We're rolling out new episodes once a week exclusively on HOLYPOST Plus. And the first episode is out right now. And guess what? It's Beth Moore. We tried to get Beth Moore into the first season of Why I'm Still a Christian because there was almost no one in America I wanted to ask that question more than Beth Moore. If you've ever wondered what's kept Beth hanging on to her faith through all the ups and downs, this is the episode for you. And if you're not a HOLYPOST member yet, now's the perfect time to join. For a limited time, you can start your membership with a free 1-week trial. And you can listen to Beth Moore explain why, after all this, she's still a Christian. Sign up now at holypost.com/plus. Enjoy the guest. We'll see you next week with more crazy. Bye. Today's episode is sponsored by Sunday's Food for Dogs. We've been talking about Sunday's Food for Dogs for a while now, and I gotta say, our dog Keena really loves the stuff, and so do we. It's healthy dog food that's easy to store and serve, made from a short list of human-grade ingredients. Sunday's contains 90% meat, 10% superfoods, and 0% anything unhealthy or artificial. Unlike other fresh dog foods, Sunday's is air-dried, so it doesn't require refrigeration or prep. Folks who switch their dogs to Sundays report softer fur, fresher breath, better energy, and more. Sundays comes right to our door, so we never run out of dog food. Easy to store, easy to serve, good for your dog. And you can get 40% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Or use code HOLYPOST at checkout for 40% off your first order. This episode is sponsored by Glorify, the #1 Christian daily devotional app. If you're like me, you'd probably love to start your day in the Bible, but you're never sure where to start or what to read. You should try Glorify, the #1 Christian daily devotional app. Start your morning with a daily Bible passage, a short devotional, and then an immersive experience called Daily Walk with God. If you need a break in the middle of your day, try one of Glorify's guided meditations or listen to their curated playlist of worship songs. At the end of the day, try a sleep meditation to calm yourself down and forget all about what someone just said about you on Twitter. Am I projecting? Right now, Glorify is offering you a free 14-day trial when you visit glorifyapp.com/holypost. Right now to download the Glorify app. That's glorify-app.com/holypost to download the Glorify app for free. glorify-app.com/holypost.
New York Times columnist Ross Douthat joins Skye to discuss his new book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. He explains why secularism hasn't eliminated humanity's hunger for the transcendent, how mystical experiences continue to challenge materialist assumptions, and why religion remains essential, even in a disenchanted world. They also discuss why committing to a religious tradition provides the depth and stability that modern seekers often lack. Here is Skye's interview with Ross Douthat.
Ross Douthat, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
As I said before we recorded, I've admired your writing for many, many years and your work with the New York Times and on the Matters of Opinion podcast. I find it wildly entertaining. And your takes on pop culture are always great as well. But you are here because you've written a new book called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. Okay, to get us rolling, for many, many years, there's been a lot of great books, some classics like C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, some more recent stuff. When I was a college student in the 90s, I remember reading Josh McDowell and Lee Strobel about, evidence for Christianity. More recently, Tim Keller's written to skeptics about faith. You've taken a somewhat different approach, one that some Christians might chafe at a little bit, because in your book, you're not really making a strong case for Christian faith. You're primarily targeting faith in general, like just religion is something that people should be after. Why did you take that approach rather than go right at the target of here's why you should be a Christian?
Well, in part, it's, as you mentioned, there have been quite a few very, very good books written over the years on exactly that theme. And, like any professional writer, I have a certain degree of confidence in my own skills and so on. But it wasn't clear to me that I had sort of a book's worth of arguments to add to the specific arguments for Christian faith that already existed and exist. What I was interested in was the sense that I had that there are a lot of people in our culture today who are interested in religion, are interested in, faith in general and Christian faith in particular, but feel like the act of sort of becoming fully religious separates them in some profound and important way from ordinary everyday reasoning, modern science, just sort of the kinds of things that a rational person should believe, right? And it seemed like there was virtue maybe in writing a book that, tries to, in effect, lay a foundation for people's potential interest in religion, for people's exploration of religious topics that a lot of people in a society that's secularized as far as ours have gone don't really have. So it is sort of it's more mere religion than it is sort of a C.S. Lewis style mere Christianity, although the book does end with a discussion of how, my own Christian faith fits into the kind of broader picture that I've sketched. And, in some part of my mind, obviously, I'm doing a kind of stealth evangelization here where, the unwary reader is brought along through general advice and, broad sweeping admonitions, and then suddenly at the end gets a little bit of the gospel into the bargain.
Indeed. Yeah, you do take us down a funnel rather subtly all the way toward your own testimony in the final chapter of the book, which is really interesting. I hope to get to that. When I was an undergraduate student at a secular university, I was a comparative religion major. And so broad study of Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, the whole gamut. And one of the things I was involved in a campus ministry in those years. And one of the things that they always tried to do was, well, don't talk broadly about religion. Bring people directly to the evidence for, say, the resurrection of Jesus or the historicity of the Gospels or something like that. Because they were worried if you take people down the whole road of religious belief, they're going to get stuck in some cul-de-sac in a faith that you don't want them to adhere to.
Right. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I never resonated with that approach, partly because of the diversity of my own background and just the way I was studying religion. And you've managed to do something pretty remarkable in this book in that you strike a balance between deep respect for the great religious traditions and affirming what they are bringing to our human experience that is good and right, while ultimately, by the end of the book, affirming your own commitment to the Catholic faith and to the supremacy of the message of Jesus. How do you respond to more fundamentalist or evangelical Christian traditions that be like, no, that's the wrong tactic, Ross. You need to just go for Jesus first. Why do that broader approach?
Well, first of all, I think that there's a lot of tactics, right, that can work and match onto different people and situations in terms of bringing people to conversion, bringing people to the Christian gospel, right? And I think there are absolutely people out there for whom, all that they need to hear and should need to hear is a kind of direct argument about the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the life of Jesus of Nazareth, the evidence for the resurrection, and so on. To be sort of the first thing to be offered is a personal relationship with Jesus. I do think, though, that there are a lot of people, again, I think more now especially, who are just in a different situation from, let's say, a potential convert to Christianity on a college campus in the year, 1967 or something, right? That, historically in American life and Western life, even among people who are not practicing Christian faith, who are not connected to the church, you could assume both a certain degree of kind of background Christianity somewhere in their life, some experience of a church or religious tradition, and, again, for all but a pretty small population of militant atheists, right, some kind of baseline assumption that, God probably exists, the universe probably exists for a reason, I probably have a meaningful place in it. Again, as a kind of foundation that you carry with you that then, the Christian revelation makes sense of, right? It sort of fits into that broader sense. It's like, yes, God exists. Yes, you're here for a reason. And, here's how to meet God. Here's how God came in the flesh. Here's what the purpose of your life is, and so on. And I think you just have a lot more people today who are not sort of, they're not Richard Dawkins style atheists, but they're just much more disconnected from the basic assumption that any kind of religious argument could accurately describe reality, right? That, the universe could actually be a place that is made for human beings rather than being purely accidental and contingent, and are certainly separated from the idea that it could be, really reasonable to be interested in practicing a religious faith. Again, I think there's just a lot of people who are like, well, it would be nice to be religious for sort of secondary reasons, right? That, because it's good to, impart ethics to your kids. It's good to have a sense of meaning and belonging. It's good to have a sense of community. But unfortunately, in order to gain those benefits from religion, you have to leave a sort of normal picture of the cosmos behind.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm sort of writing. I'm trying to write in part into that territory. But then the second thing I'd say, right, is that I think there are people who, might come to faith through the kind of, sort of Jesus first pitch you were describing, or, especially maybe for listeners of this show, who might already have some version of that kind of faith, right, from their childhood, who have some sort of sense of their relationship with Jesus, right, their sense of themselves as Christians, but who also might feel that relationship or that faith somehow exists in like a different category from other beliefs about the world, right? And I feel like there's a dynamic that you get in individual lives often where someone can have very strong religious faith and then some piece of that religious world picture can be challenged in some particular way. And maybe it's, a scandal in the church, or maybe it's, a problem with a particular teaching or idea, right? And then you can get a kind of Jenga tower effect where this one issue or question or doubt or problem becomes the piece that, when removed, the whole edifice of belief falls down. Right. And so I think I'm also trying to offer in this book a kind of firmer foundation for the idea that, even if you suddenly have a specific doubt or a specific problem, you're still in the right place and doing the right thing if you're trying to practice your faith seriously. And it's not something where, you decide that, there's a particular doctrine that you don't believe in anymore, and suddenly, all of your reasons to believe and, to believe and practice seem to disappear.
And it's something we've seen quite a bit in evangelical circles. They're talking about the word deconstruction comes up all the time. And it's this notion that something I was taught as a kid in my faith tradition turned out not to be true, or turned out to be invalid because of the behavior of some terrible religious leader. And
right.
That piece of the Jenga tower, as you put it, gets pulled out and the whole thing starts to crumble down. But behind all of that, and I think you're touching on this, we've grown up over the last number of decades, or maybe we're similar in age, there was this cultural assumption that smart people are atheists and stupid people are religious. And that
let's be ill-informed, underinformed people.
You're being more generous.
Underinformed people.
Okay, underinformed people are more religious. And if they just knew more, they would abandon these things, even though there are secondary benefits to being religious, like you mentioned, moral community support, things like that. Are you finding from your perch, whether at the New York Times or in other circles you move in, are you finding more people in established secular circles questioning that assumption that secular atheism is inherently more intelligent? Are there more people who are spiritually curious in your community, in your experience? Is that part of what led you to want to write this kind of an apologetic for the religious life?
I mean, one, yes, unquestionably. I think we have sort of gone through a big shift in sort of parts of the culture that are not especially religious, right? Especially, sort of what you might call the intelligentsia, right? Where you've gone from a period of pretty strong confidence in narratives about secular progress, the superiority of secular liberalism over religious and conservative alternatives, that the period of the new atheist sort of dovetailed with, right? It wasn't that everybody in the intelligentsia agreed with Richard Dawkins, or, right. In fact, plenty of people are like, oh, this is sort of gauche, it's sort of gauche to argue so strenuously that there's no God. But there still was a kind of convergence between this sort of Obama era sense about, a technocratic elite that has things figured out, and the new atheists' argument that, once we left the myths and pieties of religion behind, the world would become a better place. And I think those ideas, for reasons that are connected, I think, to the trend towards deconstruction and evangelicalism, right? The last 10 years have been hard on everybody's narratives and certainties, right? But in the world of secular liberalism, definitely there's less confidence in progress, less confidence in technocracy and experts and science to sort of deliver on results, way more existential and metaphysical angst a lot more depression and anxiety. You know, much of this is mediated, I think, by technology, smartphones, and so on. But it's operating on people in ways that I think are reminding them of, you know, the difficulties with not believing that human life has any ultimate purpose, right? The difficulties with not believing that, you know, that the soul is real, right? The difficulties with having a purely materialist horizon. That, you know, if that worldview can work out okay if you have this confidence that, okay, and things are getting better all the time and we've got things figured out, but then you hit a difficult period and suddenly what do you have to fall back on? Not that much. So out of all of that, yes, there's definitely a lot more interest in religion, certainly a lot more interest in spirituality, spiritual practice and experience. There's a little bit of the 1970s, right, about this moment, astrology, psychedelics. You know, there's a revival of interest in UFOs. You know, there's all of this stuff going on. At the same time, I still think that the idea you just started with, right, that, like, again, not so much intelligent versus stupid, but the well-informed person versus the less informed person. There's still an assumption that the better informed you are, the harder you should find it to believe in God. So even as there's this ferment and interest and sort of desire to look again at religion, there's also this stumbling block, I think, that says, you know, the more you know, the less you should believe.
Right. So I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of the conservation of religious energy in a society. And as people take that energy away from traditional religion, it's going to find an outlet somewhere. And Andrew Sullivan and others have written that more and more Americans in recent years have put that religious energy into their politics. Maybe progressives, well, you got the Christian nationalists on the right as well, but the progressives put that religious energy.
It's on both
absolutely.
sides.
But as progressivism has come up short, it has led some to rethink, well, number one, maybe this isn't the hope I thought it was going to be. And is it causing some of them to reconsider maybe this religious energy should be redirected back toward actual religion? And your book seems perfectly positioned to help them think through that possibility. To continue down this road, you have a wonderful section. A lot of the book at the beginning deals with science and the scientific evidence for religion, or even the way that science validates the religious worldview. But I want to continue on this assumption that the more informed someone is, the less religious they're likely to be. A lot of people point to the fact that, well, there's a lot of scientists who are not religious in our society. And that's evidence that the more knowledge one acquires, the less likely you're to be religious. And on page 37, you say this: in a recent global survey, the largest religious belief gap between scientists and the general public was in the United States. It was substantially narrower in places like Turkey and India, and reversed in Taiwan and Hong Kong, where scientists are actually slightly more likely to be religious than the general public. So there's a social dimension to the scientific connection to non-belief. Why is that important in our context, and what should that make somebody who's skeptical of religion? What pause should that give them?
Well, I mean, I think, they should recognize in part that there's a kind of historical contingency related to specific Western controversies that have to do with, you know, specific Western institutions, including my own Catholic Church, right? Going all the way back to the Galileo affair, that have conditioned an assumption among a lot of working scientists that, you know, they should expect to have their findings challenged by religious fundamentalists of various stripes, right? And that this is sort of the fundamental dynamic, the dialectic of science and religion, right? That science finds things out that undermine religious arguments, and therefore it makes sense for the scientist to have sort of a default assumption that that the religious worldview isn't true, right? If you pit two groups against one another in enough cultural controversies, it's not really surprising that, that both groups might be hostile to one another, but certainly that the group that feels like it's sort of, constantly embattled and up against some kind of religious critique would not be especially open to the particular arguments of religion. And in fact, I think for that reason, where you do have a certain, a model of thinking among certain kinds of scientists that you'll encounter, right, where they will hold some beliefs about the universe that are sort of at least on the threshold of being religious, that they'll be sort of open to concepts about design and order and ultimate reality that, sound like they're tiptoeing in the direction of what a Christian philosopher or a Christian scientist, a practicing scientist who's a Christian, not a member of the Church of Christian Science would say. But they have an allergy to ever, going as far as to say that these are religious beliefs, or, it's like, well, it's fine to have an abstract concept that's something like God, but the idea of a personal God, let alone the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's just too much, right? So you get that dynamic.
Yeah, let's go down that a little bit, because you build a case that essentially science has ended up in a cul-de-sac of sorts because of, and I'm sure most of our audience aren't familiar with these terms, but we can unpack them, the anthropic principle, and then the way the multiverse hypothesis is used to try to get out of that. Explain what those things are. And I know it's just one of the many pieces of scientific exploration you engage in here. But
I would imagine that many of your listeners have heard about the debates about fine-tuning, right? This is basically to radically simplify the idea that there are a lot of possible universes out there. Like, there's a lot of workable ways that the laws of physics and the different constants and so on could be set up. And almost all of those possible universes, as far as we could tell, would never yield, stars, planets, Earth, biological life, human beings. And in fact, these are not sort of these are things, obviously, that Christians and religious believers have become very interested in, but they're not arguments made by religious people. They are arguments made by working scientists. The odds of ending up with this particular universe, the kind of universe that supports life, supports conscious life, makes our conversation right here possible, those odds are unfathomably long. Like, not 1 in a million, but something much, much higher than that. Like, you're winning, to use the title of a book on these themes, a cosmic jackpot, right, to have a universe like ours. Now, that I think that seems, on a sort of superficial reading, like a kind of pretty strong indicator that this universe was in some sense designed, made, created with. Again, you don't have to say that human beings are the only point of the universe, but if you have a universe fine-tuned to produce conscious life, and as far as we can tell, we're the only kind of conscious life, maybe others, but it's, out there, that's a pretty strong signal that something intentional is going on here. So the strongest possible counter-argument is basically a kind of, it's basically an attempt to sort of do for cosmology what Darwin did, arguably, for evolution, right? To say, it appears that this universe is designed. But in fact, there are, millions and billions and potentially an infinite number of universes that all exist. We are just, one universe in a near infinite multiverse. And so all those other dead universes, they exist too, right? And of course, there's no one in them to observe them. You can only have an observer, right, in this particular kind of universe. So we're congratulating ourselves on having been specially chosen, but in fact, it's just that, you can only observe a universe where there's an observer. We're observing it, great, but there's a billion, trillion other ones out there, and we're actually not so special at all. And there's several issues with this move. One issue is that I think there's some pretty strong arguments that even positing a multiverse doesn't get you out of this question of design. And, there's some arguments in the fine-tuning debate about whether the multiverse itself would have to be fine-tuned, that, I'm not competent to adjudicate them. But that there is that problem, right? It's like, well, we can explain this universe if we assume a machine that generates infinite universes. Well, it's still kind of an interesting thing. But then there's also the reality that we don't observe these other universes. There are there are some reasons to hypothesize about them. I'm not saying that there's no plausible argument in the physics that they could exist, but you are essentially positing an infinity of inaccessible, invisible to us realms in order to escape from the apparent evidence that this universe is here for a reason and we're here for a reason. And it's just a very curious move. And it resembles, to my mind at least, when the Ptolemaic system was not working particularly well, right? Before Galileo came along, right? You had, the Earth was supposedly the center of the universe, but the orbits didn't all make sense. And scientists and philosophers kept adding on what were called epicycles, like these extra orbits. Right? If you add on enough epicycles, you can make how the planets are working make sense. And the multiverse seems a bit, to me, like epicycles for materialism, basically. Add on an extra billion universes to make the system of our universe make sense without a creator God.
Yeah, it also feels to me like some scientists, in order to avoid a theological question about the existence of a creator, are going beyond science to offer a philosophical solution, which is also beyond the realm of science to ever reach or prove or disprove. You can't have access to the multiverse to know whether it exists. So it doesn't feel to me like you're answering a scientific question with a scientific answer. You're answering a scientific question with a philosophical answer. It's just the one you would prefer rather than the one you don't.
Right. And at the very least, what you would say is it's a highly speculative answer that is not subject to any of the normal methods of scientific investigation. It is effectively, I should say at this point, right, a non-falsifiable hypothesis, right. Which is, an accusation that gets hurled at religious believers fairly often.
Exactly. That's the irony of the multiverse argument. We don't have a ton of time left for this part of the conversation, but I want to talk about another chapter in the book about disenchantment. And it's related to the scientific stuff. You talk about how since the Enlightenment, we have been disenchanting the world. Charles Taylor and others have talked about this at length. And you would assume that as scientific knowledge grows within a society, that it would become less religious. And yet, the evidence suggests the opposite, that as we've become more scientifically proficient, religion has not gone away. In some cases, it's grown even stronger. And you said this at one point, when intellectuals stopped taking mystical experiences seriously, actual human beings kept on having those experiences. Talk about that in today's world. How do you see, despite our technology and our scientific proficiency, an ongoing draw toward mystical experience, inexplicable experience, even among secular people?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is true is that as we have allegedly disenchanted the world, religious institutions have without question gotten weaker. And
right.
Sort of, dogmatic forms of faith have lost ground to skepticism, doubt, and sort of do-it-yourself forms of spirituality. But yes, what hasn't gone away at all is the whole range of religious and mystical experience, running from, sort of general feelings of the numinous, a feeling of oneness with the universe, the kind of things that, you can sort of at least begin to measure neurologically by hooking like a meditating Buddhist monk up to a MRI machine, right? Ranging from that to people who feel that they're, possessed by a demon, to people who have, near-death experiences, to people who claim to experience miraculous healings. All of these things have, they have remained undiminished. Again, as you said, including among people who are not themselves believers in any particular theology, right? Like people have weird mystical experiences all the time as entirely secular people. And, predictably spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the heck just happened to them, right? Like there's a whole category of really interesting books and essays and arguments that you could call like non-conversion experiences, right? People who have a mystical experience and, they don't know exactly what to do with it. So it just sort of sits there as this thing they can't quite make sense of, right? And, there are, of course, attempts to sort of explain these experiences entirely in terms of, sort of brain states and body chemistry and so on. I don't think that those arguments are particularly successful for reasons that are connected, I think, actually to the failure to have a successful materialist theory of consciousness itself. But it's important to understand that even those attempts to explain these phenomena are themselves a kind of climb down, right? Like if you go back 200 years and read, David Hume and sort of skeptical literature from the late 18th century, there was this really strong conviction that once you didn't have, established churches anymore, once you didn't have kids required to go to Sunday school, once people weren't constantly passing down the stories about, Jonah and Jesus's healings, people would just stop believing in these things because they were myths and legends and confabulations, right? And Hume does say, look, people have a propensity toward the marvelous, so there'll still be some belief, obviously, in these things. But basically, the assumption is you're going to have a steep decline in, sort of belief in an claimed experience of the mystical once people aren't being told by religious authorities that these experiences are real. Nothing like that has happened, right? Nothing like that has happened. And the fact that it hasn't happened is itself, I think, a pretty broad stream of data and evidence that needs to be fitted into any coherent picture of the world. And the religious world picture, as with the fine-tuning stuff we were just talking about, just makes a lot more sense of a lot of this stuff than does materialist reductionism.
Many years ago, I think I've told this story before on the show, I was invited to New York with a group of other Christian leaders, younger Christian leaders at the time. And a funder had drawn us together because he wanted to learn more about what was going on in the church. And the first night we were together, he asked all of us to share our stories around a wonderful dinner. And we did that. The next morning, we gathered again, and this donor who had been taking notes on all of our stories observed a couple of commonalities. We came from very different backgrounds, Christian backgrounds, but very different traditions and backgrounds. And he said, all of our stories had three things in common. One, we all mentioned a significant trauma or pain that we had gone through. Two, we all mentioned some kind of mystical experience, even those of us who did not come out of Pentecostal or charismatic Christian backgrounds. And three, none of us actually mentioned a church leader or pastor or priest in our story. Not that they weren't present, but it didn't occur to us to mention any of them. But it was fascinating that here was a younger group at the time of Christian leaders who all had somewhat dramatic conversion stories that all involved a mystical experience. Some that would have been right at home in your book that you mentioned that were very incredible. Before we go and maybe do a bonus segment, I want to jump ahead, because after building your case on all these different fronts for why religious belief is a reasonable pursuit, you encourage people not to just individualize their spirituality or to pursue some kind of buffet of spirituality where they just pick and choose things as they like, but to actually commit to a religious tradition. Explain why you think that's important, especially in a time when so many people have distrust of religious institutions and want that. You hear it all the time. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I'm going to just kind of piece together a spirituality. Why do you discourage readers of your book from pursuing that form of spirituality?
I mean, first, I wouldn't discourage some of that as, just a total starting place, right? If you have no experience of religion, you do want to be sort of a little bit experimental if you're trying to sort of see where there's any there. But I think you have to regard that period of experimentation as a means to an end, and that end has to be some kind of commitment and joining for a few reasons. First, just at the level of sort of, theology and belief, you, the hypothetical person, but this applies to you and I as well, are probably not a religious genius. You're probably not a once-in-a-generation mystic, uniquely capable of parsing every argument about God and religion and the universe, right? And there is, as in any other area of human endeavor, there is wisdom in joining into the conversations that are already going on, accepting, however provisionally, some of the conclusions and parameters of debate, that people before you have already set up. You're just going to get further, even if you aren't sure which is the absolute right tradition to join, you're going to get further in conversation than you are on your own. Then the same goes for practice, right? It would be very odd to say, I really want to become a great soccer player, and to that end, I'm just going to hang out in my backyard for the next 10 years kicking a soccer ball against a house, right? And what applies to sports, I think obviously applies to any kind of an attempt to sort of connect yourself to your ultimate destiny. This is not an argument for staying in a church that is mismanaged or corrupt, or staying in a community that has wounded you in some way. But one of the advantages of being a 21st century American is there are many opportunities of different kinds for religious community available to you. Even if you have been hurt or wounded or damaged in a particular place, there are other options available. And in general, you are just going to find it easier to pray consistently, to do good works, to, do the stuff that religion and your relationship with God is supposed to be about if you're in community with other people and have examples, solidarity, support, and, a little bit of pressure as well. And then finally, this gets back a bit to the mystical territory, right? But, if spiritual realities exist, right? If there is a realm of the numinous and the mystical that people can enter, there's absolutely no reason to assume that it's all perfectly safe and that every spirit or power or, thing that you might encounter on this quest has your good in mind. And there's no, if you just read the literature on people doing do-it-yourself spirituality, you're constantly running into people saying, I had an encounter with a negative entity and I don't know what to do about it, right? You read about the psychedelic literature. People are always like, what do you do when you have, an encounter with, a sort of dark force that kind of seems like it wants to steal your soul, right? What do you do then? And, the traditional religion has a lot of thoughts on the matter, but also a lot of guardrails and guidance and potential protection where, yes, of course, these institutions are flawed and go astray and can wound people, but there are other dangers besides other human beings out there in the cosmos. Again, if you take a religious perspective seriously. And institutions and their traditions have evolved in part just to provide basic forms of protection. It's not just sort of maps for the spiritual journey. It's also protections on your way that are hard to find sometimes when you're just out there on your own.
Well, it's a good word. And it's a reminder that it's hard to think of another avenue of human pursuit in which we think it's justifiable to just reinvent the wheel. But for some reason in spirituality, people think that's the way to do it. Start from scratch, pave your own path and ignore everything that's come before. Ross, the book is remarkable. I can already think of a number of folks in my life who are either skeptics, non-believers, or seekers that I think this is the right entry point for them. The book is called Believe: Why Everyone Should Be Religious. If you can stick around for a few minutes for our HOLYPOST Plus subscribers, I'd love to talk to you about your own journey. And you talk about that in some detail toward the end of the book, and how Pentecostal experience leads to Roman Catholicism, and it's just a great story. So thank you for being with us, and we'll link to your book. And if you're a HOLYPOST Plus supporter, subscriber, stick around and you'll hear more from Ross Douthat.
The HOLYPOST podcast is a production of HOLYPOST Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to HOLYPOST Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, HOLYPOST merchandise, and much, much more.